To the April 4th Policy Committee meeting. I would like to start with administrative remarks. I like that pen. From Dr. Stevenson or Dr. Rabarchek, if you have any.
Good evening. So on tonight's agenda, administration is bringing forward two policies, draft policies 915 and 004. Policy 915, school-related organizations for parents and district personnel. The administration is making a recommendation to discuss and determine whether it's necessary to move this policy forward. The draft of this policy was developed a number of months ago, but since that time, there's been discussion of whether such a policy is necessary for the Radnor Township School District. Policy 004, which is also a draft, was brought forward by one of the members, I believe, Amy, you brought that one forward, right? 004, the original. Orientation program for new board members. It's a proposed draft for a new policy that will help to memorialize the process of orienting new board members to learn, understand, and practice of effective governance principles and protocols of the school district. So those are the two we'll be discussing.
Great. And I'd like to welcome everyone to public comment. There's a sign-in sheet on the side table if you'd like to come forward and make a public comment. And while you come up, come on up. While you come up, I just wanted to welcome Andrew and Lord and Andrea McMenamin, our student rep and our teacher rep. Welcome.
Judy Sherry, Governor's Circle, Newtown Square. I guess one of my main comments is about the minutes. Minutes from March 22nd discuss the agenda item number 6, policy number 121, field trips. And the action says that Dr. Rabarchek presented a revised policy, and the committee direction was to continue researching and revising this policy and to develop an accompanying AR. So there was no closure on field trips and the district funding of field trips. Field trip policy is not included on today's agenda and is now listed for future discussion, possibly next meeting. I'd just like to point out that the public has brought this issue forward for over 2 years. The AR referenced in the following comments, which I'm going to read to you 2 years ago, still seems to be the same one that is posted today. In the future, by the way, a date should be included in posted ARs and revised ARs to identify any changes so that it's easy to figure out, oh, this isn't the right document I'm looking at. But here are my comments related to funding specifically with field trips that I stated on March 24th, 2015. That's over 2 years ago. My final comment is the district's funding for field trips. On tonight's agenda, there are several trips up for approval that have already happened, but the far more troubling issue is the mystery that surrounds how much money the district contributes to the cost of a trip. I have reviewed Policy 121 on field trips and the administrative regulations, which I said are still the same ones posted, for Policy 121. The only reference to cost in these documents is in Roman numeral 5, page 2 on the AR. Quote, admission costs as established by the institution, agency, or firm visited shall be borne by the student. Sufficient advance notice of major trips and exchanges should be given, which would allow students to earn the money to cover trip expenses. End of quote. Also on page 2, Roman numeral 7, requests for day trips must include expenses to be paid and the cost to each student. As I said back then, this process is opaque, lacks consistency, and it's really impossible to get a clear understanding on how these resources are allocated. That's resources for funding field trips. What specifically is guiding the administration on deciding how much to fund? I'm sure it's not random, but it has that appearance. I would appreciate if board members, policy committee members, or an administrator would explain what is guiding these trip funding decisions. If these guidelines are not clearly delineated, the decisions to fund can be perceived as biased or picking favorites or just plain not fair. There needs to be a fair and transparent explanation of how the district determines its trips its trip funding so that students, parents, and teachers accurately understand the formula for how these decisions are determined. That's what I said March 24th, 2015. And we're still like inching our way along here. I mean, let's get some closure on this issue. It's ridiculous. You would think that people could sit down and in a reasonable amount of time come up with a formula or an explanation. So I bring that forward. I don't want to take up more time because I noticed that everybody here probably heard me at the last meeting on facilities, but I would like to bring forward to policy that I feel that the mattress fundraiser sign on Lancaster Avenue needs to be reviewed as to whether or not that is really the board's direction, that we have a sign that says Radnor High School fundraiser when it's really apparently a Booster Club's fundraiser, and whether that's not really telling the whole story as it should be told, and whether or not the PTSA can sponsor a private company like Catalyst to do the SAT and ACT preps, whether or not, and advertise it in all of our publications in like 10 different resources, and enable the Catalyst to come on our property. I don't know if we charge them for it. My sense is we may not, and give these boot camps and collect this money. And I'd like to know how many students participate, how much does the PTSA get out of this, and is this really the program that we're endorsing? Because it should be very clear, even if we say we're not endorsing it, we're endorsing it because it's in all these different publications. Thank you.
Just a quick comment about the school-related organizations of parents and district personnel. Most of these things speak to one school, and sometimes there are organizations that go across many schools.
Thank you. Welcome.
Good evening, Cindy Spurtle, 106 Valley Forge Terrace, Wayne. In addition to Ms. Sherry's comments, which she forgot, going through the orientation program policy number 004 for new board members, in addition to the sessions concerning the following topics, Sunshine Act, which I thought was a very good addition. I'm just going to reiterate everything that Ms. Sherry said about field trip policies because as many years as I've been attending, I can't understand why we haven't come up with a policy for funding field trips either. And then the question that has been raised many times, and I raise it probably every committee meeting and every board business meeting, and that's about, I guess, every committee meeting for policies, the timeliness of ARs. I noticed tonight there's a new policy to be discussed and there is an AR. I understand now that the AR is not approved by the board, but it is reviewed by the board. And we have a new policy that now has been presented to the board for second reading, and that's on attendance based on some changes in the law or new federal laws. And we still have not seen the AR for that. As just an example. Thank you.
Just for clarification for the attendance, there was an AR that was attached. I can make sure you get that AR.
It has been.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I don't know if the members of the public who commented, I just want to briefly recap. We actually, you might want to review the tape from last month. We actually had a very robust discussion about how we think the best way for the district to move forward on talking about the funding of field trips. And this committee specifically discussed last month that this is not the policy in which to address that mechanism because it's more of a finance. And so just so people know in the public, it's my intention to bring that comment and that concern to the chair of the finance committee so that we can make a plan on the best way to move forward on that. So, and we did discuss that plan last month, but it may not have been picked up by everybody. So let's get on with the agenda. With that, I'd like to... It's on the tape. The minutes do not recap the entire meeting. That is the reason that we tape and put meetings on the website. So,
Can I make a comment about Cindy's public comment?
sure, absolutely.
So I just want to make a comment about Cindy's public comment. Cindy, I just want to thank you for that because I think in our policy we have a note when you are following a speaker, referencing them and just saying I agree with or I disagree with their comment rather than restating. So I really appreciate your use of the time. So thank you.
Oh, yeah, no, that's great. That was great use. Okay, now with that, do we have an approval of the minutes? Is everybody good with the minutes? Yes, yes, yes. Okay, then let's go on to item number 1, which is a first read of policy 004. And before we even get started, I'd like to say that I think that the comment made about adding the sunshine law right off the bat, I think that's an excellent thing to add to the orientation and a really important pickup, so thank you. I'd like to personally just make that recommendation that we add that because I think that's a good add to this policy and an important one.
So as I said, this is policy 004, orientation program for new board members. As I said, this was brought forward by Amy Goldman at it was I think 2 months back, in regards to just making sure we have something memorialized in our policies that indicates how we approach the orientation for new school board members. So I'll leave it open to conversation at this time if you have anything that you'd like to add or delete.
Okay, do we have any, do you have any comments, Amy?
Yes, I wanted to thank the committee and the administration for taking this policy into consideration. I think I was thinking about the upcoming election and my own experience of being elected to the board and how useful I thought it would be for all of us in light of having a new superintendent and board leadership changes from time to time to have us, as you said, memorialize a process where we're all indoctrinated with the same education about serving on a school board. So I want to thank the committee for agreeing to move this forward for consideration. In terms of specifics, this policy was brought forward as a template from Lower Merion School District. And so therefore, I just wanted to call attention to item number 2, because I think that some of the terms in there are not consistent with what we use. So I would bring up the idea of perhaps modifying things like buildings and grounds to be called facilities, for example. I would, legal compliance, I sort of see as school law. They're just changing the words a little bit to reflect Radnor's terminology and culture, to look a little bit more closely at that. I agree with Susan Stern that Sunshine Act and the suggestion from the public that is something that's important for us to cover as well. In terms of budget, I didn't know if budget development or what about the budget. I just think maybe it needs another word. And I also was wondering for D, district support services. Again, that was something that was in Lower Merion's policy, and perhaps Mr. Christofko, being that he's the solicitor for Lower Merion, I believe as well, could tell us what they mean by that, or maybe you know. I wasn't quite sure what that meant. I don't think it's a bad thing to have on there, but I don't know if it's clear enough about what that topic is for us.
Sure. My understanding would be the Office of Student Services.
Okay, so maybe
we
we
can-
call it student services and they call it something else, so maybe we just keep the terminology consistent with Radnor's terminology. And the only other comment I had in thinking about this is that I know in districts like Westchester, when these kinds of, they have a similar program that they do with their board leadership also participates. So I was just wondering not to impose any extra commitment on board leadership, but sometimes it's nice to have board leadership, if they can attend, be a part of that as grooming that relationship with new board members. And since board leadership can change frequently too, maybe if there are things that are changed, it's a good idea board leadership attends this as well. Those are my comments.
Okay. Dave, do you have comments?
Yeah. So I have 2 comments. One, in the sentence where it says the program shall be held as soon as possible, but within 2 months of appointment or election. I think that should be preferably within 2 months of appointment or election. A time frame like that, you don't want to put the board or board members in a position where they could be in violation of a board policy just because of a scheduling issue, especially when you go further in the policy and you're trying to coordinate between all parties. You just want to give some flexibility there so we don't create inconsistency. Secondly, I would say that all new board members should endeavor to participate in all sessions. Again, I want to, if there's one board member whose schedule does not allow and it's pushing the meetings back and back, I don't want that board member to, again, be in violation of a policy because of a scheduling concern. So I think board members will want to participate in these things, or they probably wouldn't run for office. But I just want to give flexibility to scheduling. That's my comment.
Great, thanks. Julia?
My only additional comment is more of a philosophical one, and it is something to think about moving forward. I think this policy captured very nicely the orientation that we were given most recently a year and a half ago about, but I also saw it as a best practice. And my question then is, where do we delineate what's a best practice versus something that really should be a policy? I don't know the answer, but some could argue that this is a best practice. And there are tons of best practices that might be policy worthy, and we'll be here all day.
Okay. So that comment, I would like for us to discuss as the four of us first, and then depending on what kind of answer we get, I want to get feedback from Andrew and Andrea if they have any. But let's talk about that for a second, because I think it's a good point, and I think it will be the thing that we should think about as we move forward as a committee, so that we don't put policy after policy after policy in our pamphlets, but in our policy binder. But for me, a good example of a best practice that should not be a policy is the notion that we wouldn't, for me, I wouldn't say we should codify what board protocol should be, which is H, in its own policy. I think that that's the realm of best practices. But that we should have an orientation that we're going to have board protocol and that there is a budget process and all of those things. For me, I feel comfortable saying this is actually so important, I would codify it. That's me, and I want to hear what the committee feels. The majority of the committee, the whole committee, what have you, and then we're going to see what the whole board says if it goes forward as a first read. So the majority of the board might agree with you. I don't know. And they might say, it's really good best practice, don't think we need to codify it as a policy. My personal opinion is I think it's of such importance that we have a consistent approach to orienting new board members that this is something that is worth codifying.
And I will agree with you. It's very important, and it's very valuable orientation I received. I just think we need to think of some kind of litmus test for the future, because there's plenty of things that are valuable best practices that one could argue should be a policy. And going forward, doesn't have to be tonight, because I'm not arguing that this doesn't merit. I'm just saying, going forward, I think it's a discussion we need to have.
Okay. I mean, at this level, do we think it's valuable to bring this forward as a policy, as a majority of the committee?
I think it's fair to get the rest of the board's feeling on whether this is necessary or if it's a best practice. I think that's a fair position.
All right, I mean, and we'll do that by virtue of bringing it forward as a first read. Amy? Yes, okay. So before we get into a couple of the details, I just wanted to see if Andrew or Andrea have any feedback on the policy. Okay. So Dave, to your point about preferably within 2 months and that we should endeavor, I personally agree with you. I think that that's probably, we don't want to start out in the gate having board members potentially being in violation of our policies. They just came on board. Right. So are we comfortable as a committee changing that wording? So Tony, we're going to change that wording to add the word preferably within 2 months. Yep. And in the last sentence, we're going to say all new board members should endeavor to participate. Yes. Amy, with regard to some of your word changes for the list in 2, I think that I would personally suggest that we maybe add the word budget process to A. Mm-hmm. I'm okay with building and grounds, but I'm also okay with the word facilities. I don't know if if Julie and Dave have a thought on that one.
I'm fine either way.
And I think the rest of it is familiar enough terminology. I wouldn't bother trying to come up with measurably different wording. I think that there's school law, but there's also legal compliance is kind of beyond just school law. Amy, that's the reason why I'm actually okay with that one. We have lots of, things that might be beyond that. Ken, do you have any thoughts on this? I mean, Mike, I'm sorry.
One of the things that's typically in the legal compliance orientation are things like Sunshine Act, deadlines for taking certain actions that are required to be taken under the school code, as well as matters involving confidentiality and for both student and employee matters and so forth.
Right. I agree with you, but I think that's the reason why I didn't want to just change F to school code, because I think there are things beyond school code. And yet, I do think sunshine law is particularly important, and it doesn't bother me, and I think, to have it there. So I think adding J as, sunshine law, and making those other two changes, budget process to A, changing facilities in C. I'd like to say that, can we move this forward as a first read and see what the rest of the board says?
Susan?
Am I correct in that the first sentence of the second paragraph, instead of the president of the board of school directors and the superintendent, it should be board leadership and the superintendent?
No.
No.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't address Amy's comment about that. I think that the president of the board is the board, board leadership. I don't think we need to encumber but that's me. And, do we have a
What
thought
I
on-
was suggesting is the last sentence. All new board members and board leadership are, with Dave's more flexible wording, invited to or requested to.
Why don't you
or-
just say all board members should endeavor?
All board members? Mm-hmm. So it's an annual thing for all of us. I don't have,
Well, it wouldn't
Or
be
no.
annual. It would be at most every 2 years.
right. That, I like that even better.
So just all board members should endeavor to participate in all
Yeah,
sessions.
and I don't actually agree with that. I do think that it is for new board members. This is a very specific thing that is intended to orient new board members. I don't have the strong feeling, so when I read the second paragraph, the president of the board and the superintendent will plan jointly and execute the orientation program. That, for me, is the implicit that the president will deal with this, and I don't necessarily view it as critical for the vice president to do that. And I guess I just kind of trust a process that if the vice president wants to be involved, that leadership would work that out and have it be, have that be workable. But when you look at it's very challenging to schedule these kinds of meetings. And I don't personally think that we should make it even harder by expecting both members of board leadership to attend. But that's me. And I don't, if the majority of us want to do it differently, we will write it differently.
I will say, I remember there were very long meetings, and, we can put in the wording so it's okay for people to not attend. I don't think anyone will attend unless they've got a lot of time on their hands.
Right, which is, I think the focus of this is new board members.
Right. I agree
I'm
with you.
comfortable with not adding the entire board leadership. Dave, do you have a thought?
Yeah, so I would not make any additional changes to the policy.
Okay. All right, so with the changes that we've discussed,
Yep.
I think we're going to move this forward for a first read. And then I'd like to move on to 9:15. And I'd like to set up the conversation to be kind of the way we discussed some policies last month, which is, let's kind of talk high level thoughts on this. I want to hear from the administration. We've anxiously waited to talk about this and to hear the feedback from Mr. Batchelor, from Dr. Robarczyk. I don't know if Dr. Stevenson has any thoughts on it. To see in what way does it, if at all, does it make sense to move forward on a policy that deals with school-related organizations, and to hear from the, from the committee, do we have additional or different thoughts on it? And Julia, are you comfortable with starting it with administration?
You mean
In terms of some overriding thoughts on this?
on this one?
Yes.
Sure.
Great. So let's start there, and then we can segue to the committee.
Okay, so as I mentioned in my opening comments, this is one that was a policy that was developed a number of months ago. And as I said, that time, I think there was an urgency of wanting to put something in place to kind of understand how we develop school-related organizations and of parents and district personnel. But at the same time, I think the recommendation of the administration is look to see if is this really necessary? Is this need to be a process that needs to be a policy that needs to be in place in order to support the organizations that surround our district and what they do? So, do you want to add any thoughts, Mr. Batchelor?
Sure. As I looked at the proposed policy and also the proposed guidelines to go with it, I do have some questions that it brings up more questions for me about how much then do we almost own some of these groups. It raised a lot of questions about even us evaluating their board of directors and different pieces, which I have concerns about, and I would have concerns about. It's interesting, a policy that is being created to help delineate administrative involvement in things and board involvement. I do have questions and just concerns about how much more involvement would this be creating as well. I'm also struggling, being new, just trying to understand the history, and I appreciate I've had other board members share with me some of the history and some of the need for clear communication and a clear understanding for the different groups. And so one of the questions I have is part of it is the focus on why this was brought up a couple of years ago from board members was the focus because of the different directions it's pulling board members, because board liaisons to some of the groups. Is it something that can be, I think Julia's question of best practice versus policy, is this an area where this could be something that during board reorganization each year, the board looks at and discusses what are the areas that we're going to have liaison and who are those liaisons on any given year. Is that something that could be set up without having a policy? So I wish right now I have a lot more concerns about the policy. I want to try to understand what it is we're trying to solve. I want to make sure if we're bringing a policy forward that it's giving us some guidance in solving something. And right now, as my first read, it raised more questions than said, this will solve this. But I guess I hear from board members, what are we trying to solve with the policy?
Okay. Well, thank you for that. How do you want to start? Amy?
Amy's got her trigger finger ready, so.
Amy, go right ahead.
Ken, I wasn't sure if I heard you correctly, but was it your impression that this policy was brought forth by board members?
No, I think I understand. I think it was the administration started this discussion, I think, a year or two ago. And my understanding is that from speaking to administrators, that the administration brought this forward a year or two ago out of concern. Again, a year or two ago, the concern was administration being pulled at different meetings, and what groups were we then saying deserved an administrative liaison, and then the next step, which groups then deserved a board liaison as well. I could be wrong. I mean, and things change over time.
Right.
As you hear.
So I remember this being brought forward by administration in the spring of 2015. And at that time, there were some of those concerns that there were things, and I was involved in PTO leadership at the time, so I guess I was hearing a lot of this through those channels. And part of that was that sometimes the PTOs would ask questions about, and other organizations who are known to be involved with the district, what qualifies for access to various resources based on which group you are. And those resources could be facilities, they could be communication, it could be a board liaison, it could be an admin liaison, it could be, I remember, access to district mailing lists, getting mailings done by district personnel on behalf of the organization. And so the question, nobody really at that time had an answer for that. And so it became something that the superintendent at the time thought, based on a model that he had found from his work in Lower Merion, was something that might lend some clarity to how to expend district resources in a predictable and way, and what the groups that were able to benefit from those resources might need to have in place in order to meet that criteria. So it would establish criteria for groups to have a certain kind of district recognition, and then in exchange for that recognition, what that would afford those groups. Because it apparently was, at that point, a challenge for the administration to be making those decisions and not be subject to the feedback of it being arbitrary or preferential or something like that. So this was his way of trying to level the playing field among all organizations and provide guardrails for the administration to deal with these kinds of issues. So what happened at the time, and again, I think because the PTOs are one of the, aside from REF, one of the most well-known as district-affiliated groups, he was sharing this with PTO presidents at a coordinating council meeting, and the template he produced was lifted verbatim from Lower Merion. And at that time, as this made its way through meetings of various PTO representatives, what happened was that the suggestions were given to him that there were a number of things in both Lower Merion's policy and administrative regulations that did not correspond in any way, shape, or form to Radnor practice or Radnor culture or Radnor organization. And he agreed, I remember seeing correspondence, he agreed that that was the case and was willing to make those changes. But the policy and the AR never proceeded from there. The changes were not made, and the policy never saw the light of day at the policy committee level. So this policy has, even though it was brought up by the administration in the spring of 2015, kind of died on the vine, I'd say probably in the spring of 2016, and has really not ever been anything other than a very, very, very preliminary draft based on taking a template verbatim from Lower Merion.
And so
Amy.
could I just clarify? Oh, sorry.
I hope this is helpful. I mean,
It's very helpful. This draft here doesn't take into account what then the administration at the time in 2015, or somewhere between 2015 and the dying of the vine in spring of 2016, this draft here doesn't take into account what the administration at the time thought should be included to take into account what is already current practice here or correct a current practice here.
Actually, it didn't take into account the only people who really saw this initially were PTO leadership. And they gave feedback. I mean, this was going to be a process. My impression is this was going to be a process. And the PTO leadership asked for modifications to this, which Dr. Kelly agreed to make, and they were substantial, but that they never happened. And then that was sort of the end of that, other than people saying whatever happened to that policy.
Okay. Amy, so I appreciate all the background, but I think if I heard Ken at the beginning of this, in terms of a policy, if we're going to move one forward, the history and the background is helpful, and I think it's super helpful for Ken, who's new, but I also want to make sure that when we're talking, as we move forward on this, we would want it to be a policy that supports our district's, endeavors and our district's goals. So in terms of any policy that might exist around this versus even a best practice, to Julia's earlier point, what do we think would be helpful, or how could a policy moving forward be helpful to what the district wants to achieve? Because, with all due respect, Dr. Kelly's not here anymore. And so we want to make sure that the policy reflects what the district needs now moving forward.
And that's reasonable. And I, as a representative, as chair of government relations and communications, I think it's been stated pretty explicitly and repeatedly by Michael Petiti that he is one of the administrators who probably encounters these conundrums and challenges in terms of the resources that his department has to offer. And he feels that it has for some time created a conundrum for him to know how to equitably distribute his resources to various groups without any parameters. So it's not like this is just because Dr. Kelly isn't here that the conundrums have gone away. That is one of the things that is in very much currently impacting the communications department.
Okay, so that's a perfect example. So one of the things that you're telling us is that this policy, one of the things you would hope to see in it is that would help to clarify that conundrum that Michael faces with regard to the resource called district communications.
Yes.
Okay. Are there others? I mean, other thoughts, high-level things that you think could be of value in a policy?
I think Dr. Stevenson has
Oh, sorry.
I just wanted to, just from a historical perspective, one of the things that came out of this that I think that needs to be discussed is about organization recognition, which ties in what Ms. Goldman is talking about, where which organization, and it has a historical of one organization wanted to use space for a meeting. And then other organizations have been used to determination about how does the district determine if a group of parents or school-related affiliates decide that they want to use our resources, whether it's communication, which she outlined, or it's a building use for a meeting, which has association with the district, then to what degree that we say that as a district that, yes, we recognize you as an organization because you want to meet because this has something to do with school and students. And so that's where it grew out of. And so not necessarily, so as we having this discussion, then there are three things historically that came out of this. Recognizing an organization, to what degree does the district provide resources to support those, and then, which was already discussed, to what degree do we then have an association when you're talking about liaison or recognition, whether it becomes, and one of the examples that was used is like PAGE is one of those organizations that is a board that has a liaison. So there were other organizations that came forth to the administration that said, we also would like some of those same things. And then when they were not allowed to give that same recognition, then the question was, then how do you get it? And there is no historical factor on that. So part of it is to get the clarity on about those so we can move forward. So how we decide about this, I think that I didn't want to lose that historical perspective first.
No, I appreciate that. So Anthony, when you're talking about the kinds of things that would be important is that this policy could be helpful around what's going to be the process for, if I hear you, organization recognition, which then would kind of could drive, what kind of meeting space or other districts' resources, or could they expect equitably. One of them might be an administrative liaison. You mentioned board liaison. Okay, so those are some things. Yes, I want to try to get it from a list standpoint because I don't want to necessarily have us be attached to the wording that was given to us that was, from 2 years ago. That may or may not be the policy that works and serves you best.
Well, that was one of the things about this policy was, do we just need a set of procedures or do we actually need a policy?
And that's where I'm hoping to
that's
get
where
some
we
clarity
were.
on our direction tonight. So, Amy, do you have other thoughts or, objectives with a policy from this?
Well, the word process, you used the word process, Susan, and I forget the exact sentence in response to Dr. Stevenson. The process for establishing official recognition, is that the wording? I think it's also the word criteria. If that is part and parcel of the word process, I think criteria is helpful. What do organizations need to have in terms of criteria in order to then go through a process of receiving board recognition as a district-affiliated group?
Okay. All right. Are there others?
Yes,
Okay.
I'm sorry, I
No,
thought-
no, Dave, go ahead. If you've got something to jump in.
Are you done, Amy?
I'm done.
Great.
I guess my question here is, for me, the most important thing that this policy or set of criteria should guide is whether or not we assign a board representative to a group, because that deals with board resources. I think beyond that, it should be at the administration level as to how we allow groups or folks to use our facilities and so forth. We should just have criteria established there. I don't know if it needs to be a policy, but there needs to be something that guides which groups get a board member to attend their meetings and report back, and then ultimately have that brought to the community. I don't know where that guideline is. I don't know if we have something there. I think that's a completely arbitrary process, but I think, to me, that's the most important thing. I think use of facilities and things like that can be handled outside of our realm. I've always wondered why people get reps and why other people don't.
Okay. That's your thing. Julia?
Yes, I agree with you. And for me, yes, you are. Go get a lottery ticket. I wonder if, for me, the issue with the board liaison and the administration liaison is it's such a finite resource. Our time, administrative time, that that is something that I question what should receive it and what shouldn't, what's practical and what's not. Regarding, space or resources like public relations promotion, I ask you, Mr. Batchelor, is that not a question that you could manage in your own best judgment, or do you feel a need for guidelines written?
I think it's helpful. I do think it's helpful for us to have some guidelines that we do work, whether it's a policy or guidelines, but I think we, as an organization, it's going to be helpful to have some guidelines for how we do that. And I listed some of the things here, the challenge of, I'll make Dave feel even better. I'll start with his, agreeing with his, but when do we assign a board member? The process / criteria for establishing recognition. The challenges of communication. When we have, we do have our Radnor reader. When do things get in the reader? When do things go on a community bulletin board? I think we have some of those things in place already now, but I do think there are different situations and events that challenge maybe our current guideline. Does our current, and I can't answer this fully, I did look at it this weekend in preparation, looking this over, does our current facilities use, does that guide us on which organizations have to pay to use the facility versus other organizations that don't have to pay? Does that give us enough guideline? So I think there's enough things here that for us to go back and look and say what are those areas that we need to establish a guideline, and then once we look to try to see what it is we're trying to solve, we can then establish what it is. Do we need a guideline, or do we need to go as far as a policy with this? And are there things in-house that are already addressing these issues?
Okay. So, thank you, everybody. This has been really good feedback. I'd like to take it in one direction with Mike Christofko, and then I'm going to break slightly with tradition because I think that we have, this is the kind of conversation that I think a committee, hearing from the public at this juncture briefly, if there's something, can be really helpful. And so if there are people who would like to give some brief input, please come up. Because we're kind of in a formative conversation. But what I'd like to ask Mike is, the word that I'm hearing here is, could guidelines best serve the objectives at hand? And so my question to you is, do we already have an existing policy, or could it be that we already have an existing policy that gives, Mr. Batchelor and the administration the authority that they need to create the kind of guidelines that they're talking about? So, because to me, we can't just create guidelines without some kind of authority based in policy, but perhaps I'm wrong. That's my question to you.
Well, if you're talking about, is there in any policy somewhere that gives the administration the authority to create regulations that would specifically address this topic, I'm not really aware of that. I mean, there are certain areas where for example, the facilities use policy, there's authority that's given to the administration there to develop like the fee chart and some other things with how facilities are used. That may be sufficient to address one part of this, but it's certainly not sufficient to address what organizations get recognized, what criteria they would have to have. I'm not aware of any existing policy that would give the administration the authority to create regulations on those issues. Now, as far as just creating guidelines that would generally be followed, I mean, I guess you could do that. My only concern with that is that, would those guidelines be memorialized somewhere, and if so, how would they be distributed and maintained? I think it's probably better to just do it through an administrative regulation, and that could be something just whereby this policy might just be reduced to, it's the policy of the board to, have organizations recognized in a way that the administration will determine based upon regulations which administration will prepare.
Okay.
Something real simple like that. Or if you wanted to address the issue about the board liaison, you could do that in the policy and then direct the administration to prepare regulations covering everything else.
Okay, so thank you for answering that. I would like to
May I
take.
ask a question?
Sure.
We have a policy 913, which is non-school organizations, groups, and individuals. So to me, that begs the question, if we have a policy for non-school organizations, groups, and individuals, might we need one that it defines or addresses some of the issues for school organizations, groups, and individuals? I mean, we have one for now this is a PSBA policy, granted, but it's for non-school groups. Why would we not have one for school groups?
I think that's point well taken. Thank you. So could you give your name?
Yes.
Did you sign in, Debbie?
I did.
Okay, great, thanks. And I just want to give a context. I am definitely breaking with kind of our traditional, because this is a very formative kind of conversation, but we have a very hard stop tonight.
Really
Thank you.
quick, and
Thank you.
Susan, for this opportunity. Debbie Singer, 169 South Spring Mill
It's
Road.
not, Debbie, will you turn
Deb,
it
Oh,
yeah,
turn
put
it
your,
on?
yep, say
Okay.
your name again. There you go.
Debbie Singer, 169 South Spring Mill Road, Villanova. I'm here on behalf of Radnor Page, and I don't see us listed under school-affiliated groups. And Radnor Page has been a school-affiliated group for, to my knowledge, probably 20 years and maybe even more. We meet 4 times a year with Jim Kearney, and he's been a great help to us, and I think that he would agree that we've been a great help to him. I think it's important that we have a board liaison, because I don't know how else the board would know the work that we're doing and the concerns that we bring to the district from parents specifically.
Okay,
Thank you.
great, thank you. Michelle, welcome. If you could just
Thank
state
you.
your name.
Michelle Leonard, 852 Briarwood Road. I just wanted to say that we, as in PTO leadership and having been a past PTO president, we value our partnership with the board and would definitely hope that we would continue to have board liaisons and administrative partners in this. I think having someone as a point person when something comes up, instead of trying to figure out who the best person would be or who I should reach out to, if I know who that person is, in the past it's sometimes been superintendent, sometimes it's been Maureen's stepped in too. It's hugely helpful just to have that person who knows me, knows what's going on, and is one point person. So we would hope to continue that partnership, but we definitely understand the need for talking about different board recognized, because we get those questions too.
Great.
So.
Thank you.
My name is Kathy Mayer, 304 Orchard Way in Wayne. I am here representing the Radnor Committee for Special Education. And as I'm listening to the conversation today, certainly understand how a board member can help in many ways for established groups. But like ourselves, we are new to this process. And when you have kind of a startup parent-led organization, just building awareness through communications, is extremely important, particularly in our circumstance where there are many families in this district who can be somewhat intimidated, by joining a group or attending a speaker series that we have. And certainly if we have the opportunity to have our activities communicated through a district communication process, we would hit more families and I think be much more approachable to families coming to be a part of our, I think, much-needed committee. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Winters?
I think we have parents who have real issues that have been brought before you today. I think precedent is an important issue, but I also need to, having worked in different areas, I also know that when one attains such recognition, it gives that group a way to educate in ways that other groups don't have. It gives them advocacy that they might not otherwise have, and it empowers them to do things that they otherwise would not have. So I think recognition has to be very carefully provided with consistent administrative guidelines because of the kind of power that such recognition gives to that group.
Thank you. So I have not really said much about this, and my feedback on this particular policy is that, Dave mentioned the board resource. Julia's mentioned, you actually mentioned administrative resource. Amy's talked about the importance for communication resources. And, I think we hear from the community that that knowing what the chain of command and knowing what the resources are and having that, to be able to rely on that consistently and is, for both very established groups and brand new groups is really important. And for me, one of the things I have felt very strongly is that I think that we need to have a very reliable and consistent support for the administration to be able to say, this is what's going to be expected of me with regard to giving groups administrative support, and for them to have our board to give them a structure that puts a reliable, limit on that, because it could really be very inconsistent, and to support our superintendent. So my suggestion to our committee tonight, Andrew and Andrea, do you have any thoughts on this policy, just kind of formatively?
No, not at all.
Okay. What I'd like to ask our committee to do, and what I'd like to ask the administration to do, is kind of having heard all of our high-level thoughts, and knowing that we didn't really have an obligation to bring this forward as a first read, it was on the agenda that way, but made it very clear this was intended to be a conversation. And knowing that Ken is new, and this has really been his first exposure to kind of the pros and cons of this, and hearing from Mike that, perhaps there are guidelines that could be created under the auspices of a general policy. My request is that, if you guys support it, is that we ask the administration to kind of go back to the drawing board and come back to us perhaps next month, maybe the month after that. We need to take a look at our agenda for May. I know it's pretty full, on what you feel is going to best serve your objective, Ken, in terms of, addressing our community, recognizing that the groups are important, that partnership is so important. What the constraints of what your administration needs. Anthony knows what our building constraints are. You talk with board leadership, you know what the board constraints are. I think we're hearing it that we want a consistent approach to whatever it is we're going to do so that the community can rely on that. And let's see what comes from that. And it may or may not look like the policy that we have here. I'm not personally attached to this policy if it doesn't serve what's best for our district. I want a policy or guidelines that serve what's best for our district. Dave, is that something you can support? Amy, Julia?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Do you have, and there's some other issues, that I know that we talked about. Booster groups is just a whole other category of district groups that is not necessarily even served by this. That's a completely different group.
Talk about boosters, and the things that we're looking at as far as when we try to
that's
tie
a whole
them to
different
that
category.
Category that we'll have. But
Right,
we'll
no,
talk
because I know that
Mr.
conversation
Batchelor
came
on
up,
that.
and
Yes.
it's not served here.
But I would say, why isn't it served here? And
I'm not saying it's not served here. I'm
Right.
saying it's something that we need to bring back. I think it's important to for Mr. Batchelor to be briefed on some of the historical pieces on it and where we are standing on it. But I don't disagree that it doesn't come back here. But how 915 came here was separate from that. So I don't want to muddy the waters by bringing that in, because that has a whole nother piece. Then we're talking about issues that have to have distinction about the financial piece that we have to talk about, that has to include Ms. Dakow about. So those things, I think the same thing about that has to include Mr. Batchelor, so he has a clear outline about how to partialize that to bring it back to the committee.
And what I'm asking is, I think the same thing, just keep that in mind, because whatever you say, if it applies to this whole other chunk of groups that you didn't intend to have it apply to, then we'll be here forever.
Right. Okay, so with that, we're not going to take action on this item, and if there's brief final public comment, I know we had 2 members who did not comment, and we're going to wrap it up. Thank you. Welcome, Ms. Sherry.
Thank you. Getting back to field trips again and the minutes. The minutes, as we know, are the official record of what happens in meetings. So when I read the official record, and it doesn't say review the tape or something, I have to go by what is the official record. And in the official record, it says that Dr. Anthony Rybarczyk, Director of Elementary Education, blah, 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 discussion and direction, it says that he will revise this policy with language that will explain the district's philosophy of field trips and developing accompanying administration regulation that will provide language explaining the process for taking a field trip and bring it back to the committee at a future meeting. That is the action stated. If there's a different action, which I appreciate your pointing out, and it makes a lot of sense in some ways to push this to the Finance Committee, this wonderful minutes, the minutes are usually very accurate, should be amended to state that the funding for field trips will be referred to the Finance Committee for additional consideration. A brief amendment would take care of that. Thank you. Because this is the official record, not the tape.
With all due respect, Mrs. Sherry, the official record for Policy 121 is the action that was stated. A conversation took place about how we would deal with the finances, which was a public comment made. And I'm sharing that with you because I'm very clear that this is the official action that is taken with regard to that policy. You and I can disagree about that. I'm happy to discuss it with you after the meeting, but that is what the action was with regard to this policy. And I stand by that.
Yeah, well, that's fine. If this is the action that's in the minutes that's accurate, then everything else that's happening with the policy is not part of the official minutes. So, I'm sorry.
Do we have other public comment? All right, quick. Welcome, Mrs. Spartle.
Thank you. A question there was an individual that got up and spoke on an organization that's been trying to get recognized by the school district for quite some time, and that's for the special needs students. And my question is, we had another organization for the gifted students that got up and spoke also, and they've already been recognized. And I sit here and listen at both the board business meetings and committee meetings, and the request has been made for the recognition of this organization. So whatever you're going to be doing, best practices or a new policy or whatever, an answer to this organization, I think, is due after all these months as to how they get recognized by the school and when they'll be given space for meetings. Thank you.
Thank you. With that, we're going to adjourn the meeting.